She almost walked past him. That was the thing that stayed with him later, in the quiet hours when the city finally stopped pretending to sleep. She had almost kept walking, the way every single person before her had kept walking. Eyes forward, jaw set, the practiced urban blindness that people develop like a callus after years of stepping over need. Her umbrella was tilted against the rain, her coat was thin in the shoulders, and she was clearly in a hurry. He had watched her feet slow, just for a second, and he had braced himself for the sideways glance, the small acceleration of pace, the way people speed up when they want to prove to themselves they didn't really see you. But she stopped, and everything that Marcus Hale had spent 43 years building, every wall, every defense, every carefully constructed reason not to believe in people anymore, began in that single, rain-soaked moment to crack straight down the middle. 3 months earlier, Marcus Hale had been standing in a penthouse that occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building he technically owned. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was the kind of view that showed up in magazines. The city spread itself below him like an offering. Bridges lit like jewelry, river catching the late light, streets full of the small, urgent lives of people who would never ride an elevator this high. He had a glass of something expensive in his hand, and the specific kind of silence that only money can buy, which is not really silence at all, but the absence of every problem that can be solved by writing a check. He was 51 years old, and he was completely alone, and he had not let himself feel that clearly in a very long time. His phone lit up with a message from a woman he'd been dating for 4 months. She wanted to know if he was coming to her friend's gallery opening. He read the message twice. He thought about the way she laughed a little too loudly whenever he mentioned an acquisition or a headline. He thought about the dinner 2 weeks ago when she had steered the conversation so smoothly he'd almost missed it, toward his plans for his estate. He set the phone face down on the marble counter and didn't answer. This was his life. It had been his life for a long time. Marcus had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in the kind of neighborhood where the street lights went out and stayed out and nobody came to fix them. His mother had worked the breakfast shift at a diner and the dinner shift at a laundry. His father had left when Marcus was 7, which was painful, and then died when Marcus was 11, which was something else entirely, a closed door that could never open again, a conversation that could never be had. Marcus had carried that silence with him into adulthood and poured all of it into work, into drive, into the particular fury of a boy who decides the world will not get to ignore him twice. By 28, he had built his first company from a second-hand laptop and a head full of ideas that turned out to be worth a great deal of money. By 35, he was the kind of wealthy that changes the room when you walk into it. By 40, he had more than he could ever spend and less than he had ever had. Because money, he had learned with the slow devastation of accumulated experience, does not bring people closer to you. It brings people closer to what you represent. It turns relationships into negotiations and friendships into strategies. His business partner of 9 years had attempted to restructure the company behind his back when Marcus was hospitalized for a week with pneumonia. His college roommate, a man he had considered his closest friend, had sued him over a casual investment conversation that Marcus hadn't even realized was a contract. 3 different women, in 3 different years, had told him they loved him and had meant something else entirely by it. He had stopped blaming them, eventually. He had started blaming himself for being naive enough to keep expecting something different. His therapist, he had seen a therapist for 2 years before stopping, had told him that what he was experiencing was a kind of grief. He was mourning the person he had been before he learned that his value to most people was purely transactional. Marcus had listened carefully, paid the invoice without complaint, and never gone back. He was tired of talking about it. Talking, he had concluded, did not actually change anything. It just gave the pain a larger vocabulary. The idea, when it came to him, arrived not with drama, but with the particular clarity of something that has been forming for a long time just below the surface. He was watching a documentary, or rather, the documentary was on while he stared at the ceiling, about social experiments and empathy. Hidden cameras, people dressed as the homeless, ignored and then revealed. Marcus had seen variations of this before, and usually found them manipulative and tidy, the emotional payoff too neat. But this time, lying in a 4,000 square foot apartment that felt like a held breath, something in him shifted. What if he didn't just watch? What if he went looking himself? Not for content, not for proof, but for something he could no longer name but had not entirely stopped wanting. He told his executive assistant he was taking a month's leave for personal reasons. He arranged for his housekeeper to take a paid vacation. He put his car in storage, deactivated his social media, and forwarded his calls to a voicemail nobody would check. Then he went to a thrift store 6 miles from his neighborhood and spent $37, the first time in years he had thought about a price tag, on the most ordinary, worn-out clothes he could find. Jeans with a tear at the left knee, a gray sweatshirt that had faded to no particular color, a jacket that had once been waterproof and no longer was. He stood in the fitting room of the thrift store and looked at himself in the mirror and felt, with a lurch that surprised him, like he was looking at someone he recognized from a long time ago. The first thing he noticed about invisibility was how physical it was. He had expected people to look through him. What he hadn't expected was how thoroughly the body responds to being unseen. The way the shoulders begin to curve inward, the way the eyes start seeking the ground, the slow erosion of the posture that had taken him 20 years to build. He sat in the doorway of a closed hardware store on the first morning and watched the breakfast rush pour past, and not a single face turned toward him. Not one. He might as well have been a fire hydrant. He might as well have been a scuff on the pavement. He told himself this was fine. This was the point. He was observing. But the human animal is not designed to be unobserved for long without cost. By the third day, something in him was genuinely raw. Not the physical hardship, though the sleeping arrangements were more difficult than he had anticipated, and his back ached in a way that felt almost punitive. It was the sustained, accumulated experience of not mattering to a single person who passed him on the street. It was the way a woman in expensive running shoes stepped around him without breaking stride, her earbuds sealed in, her world impermeable. It was the teenage boy who looked directly at him and then said something to his friend that made them both laugh. It was the security guard who came out of the pharmacy across the street on the 5th day and told him, not unkindly, but without warmth either, that he needed to move along. Move along, as though his presence itself were a disruption, as though simply being still in a public space without money in his pocket was an imposition on the city that had once celebrated his philanthropy in its newspaper. He moved along. Weeks passed in this low, grinding register. He had brought almost nothing with him. A small notebook, a prepaid phone with a single contact saved, enough cash in a hidden money belt to get himself out of trouble if the experiment turned dangerous. He begged some days, not for need, but for data, watching how people responded. Most didn't make eye contact. A few dropped coins without slowing. One man in a business suit, Marcus recognized the suit, a brand he himself had worn, told him to get a job with the flat certainty of someone who had never had to consider the gap between advice and circumstance. He wrote in his notebook at night, in the yellow light of a bus shelter. The notebook was filling with a record of human indifference. He had expected this. He had prepared himself for this. But preparing for disappointment and living inside it are different things, and some nights he sat with the notebook in his lap and felt the specific weight of a man who has stopped being surprised by the worst and has not yet found a reason to expect the best. He was 3 weeks in when it rained. It was the kind of rain that arrives in the late afternoon with very little warning and turns serious almost immediately, the kind of rain that means business. He had ducked into the shallow overhang of a closed bookshop on Clement Street, pulling his inadequate jacket closed across his chest, and watched the street empty and then fill again with umbrellas. The cold had a quality he had not experienced since childhood, the kind that finds the spaces between things, between buttons, between resolve. He was tired, not in the way he was tired after a 14-hour workday or a difficult negotiation. He was tired in the bones, in the particular place behind the eyes where a person stores the accumulated weight of weeks of proving something to themselves they're not even sure they want to know. She came around the corner with a canvas grocery bag over one arm and an umbrella that kept turning inside out in the wind. She was fighting it as she walked, this small but apparently unwinnable battle with the weather. And there was something in the way she kept riding it, patient, persistent, refusing to give up on a clearly broken umbrella, that he watched with something that felt almost like recognition. And then she stopped, not slowed, stopped, right in front of him. She planted her feet on the wet pavement and looked at him. Not the sideways, quickly retracted look he had grown accustomed to, but a direct, settled, unhurried look. The look of someone deciding to acknowledge what is actually in front of them. She said, "Are you doing okay? Have you eaten today?" He had been asked a lot of questions in his life. He had been in boardrooms where questions were weapons. He had been in relationships where questions were tests. He had sat across from journalists and lawyers and investors and rivals whose questions were all, at their core, about what he could give them. Nobody had asked him if he had eaten. He told her he was fine. The reflex of pride, the last one standing. She looked at him for a moment like she was deciding whether to believe him, and then she reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She held it out, not extended from a safe distance, the way people sometimes offered things to the homeless, the arms stretched long, the body leaned slightly back. She held it out the way you hand something to a person you know. "I made two," she said simply. "My lunch. I've got plenty." He looked at her coat. He could see, even in the rain, that it was not a coat belonging to someone who had plenty of anything. Her name was Delia. He didn't learn this until the second time she came back, because the first time he was too stunned by the basic fact of her returning to ask. She had said, when she left that rainy afternoon, leaving him with half her lunch and a dryness in his throat that had nothing to do with thirst, "I'll be back tomorrow around the same time if you're here." He had told himself it was something people said, a kindness with no infrastructure. He had been told 100 things by 100 people who had no intention of following through, and he had long since stopped being angry about it and simply started building his expectations accordingly. He was there the next afternoon. He waited for an hour past the time she'd mentioned. His notebook stayed in his pocket. He watched the street. He had told himself that if she didn't come, he would simply record it, add it to the accumulating evidence, continue the experiment with his original conclusions confirmed. She came around the corner 20 minutes later, slightly out of breath, still fighting the same umbrella. She had brought a container of soup this time. She said she was sorry she was late, that her shift had run long. She sat down beside him on the cold concrete ledge without hesitating, without looking for somewhere cleaner or higher, and opened the container and handed him a plastic spoon, and they sat there together in the thin December light eating soup in a silence that was somehow not uncomfortable. She did not ask him how he had ended up on the street. She did not ask him about his family or his past or his plans. She talked about the bus route that kept changing and a book she was listening to on her phone during her commute and whether pigeons had any kind of inner life worth considering. She was funny in a dry, offhand way that snuck up on him. She laughed at her own observations without self-consciousness. She talked to him the way you talk to a person. Over the following 2 weeks, he learned her life in the cumulative, unhurried way you learn things when someone isn't performing for you. She worked mornings at a grocery store and 4 evenings a week at a laundry facility. She was raising her younger sister's 2 children while her sister finished a certification program. Temporary, she said, which had now been going on for 14 months. She sent money home to her mother in Fresno when she could. She had a savings account with enough in it to cover one emergency, maybe if the emergency was not too large. She was 39 years old, and she had the particular competence of someone who has never had the luxury of falling apart. One evening, she brought a blanket. She apologized for its condition before he could even see it. A patchwork thing, clearly old, the kind of blanket that has been washed and mended so many times it carries its history in its repairs. He could see where someone had stitched a fraying edge with mismatched thread. He could see a corner that had been carefully sewn back together. This was not a spare blanket. This was a blanket from someone's bed, loaned out into the cold because she had decided that he needed it more. He pressed his knuckles hard against his mouth for a moment, looking at the blanket, and then rearranged his face and thanked her. She said, "You can return it whenever. There's no rush." He tested her. He was not proud of this, but he needed to know. The part of him that had been burned enough times to stop believing needed one more piece of evidence before it would allow the rest of him to do what the rest of him was already beginning to do. He had taken to carrying a small amount of cash in an obviously visible wallet, and one afternoon while she was sitting beside him, he let it fall, deliberately, in a way that could plausibly look accidental. Then he stood and started walking away. He heard her call out before he reached the corner. She was on her feet and moving toward him with the wallet already in her hand, holding it out, slightly breathless from the quick movement. She pressed it into his hands. He opened it. The money was all there, $40 in small bills, visible and uncounted. He said, "Please keep some of it. For the soup, the blanket." She shook her head. "It's yours." He said, "I want to give you something for your kindness." She said, "I don't help people because I expect something back. I do it because it's the right thing. That's all it ever needs to be." She said it without grandeur, without looking for a reaction. She said it the way you state a thing that is simply, self-evidently true. He stood on the pavement with his recovered wallet in his hand and felt something happening in the center of his chest that he did not have an efficient name for. A kind of opening, or a kind of return, or the particular sensation of a door being found in a wall you had stopped believing had doors. That night, in the bus shelter with his notebook, he did not write anything for a long time. He sat with the pen uncapped and the page blank and let himself feel what he had spent 3 weeks out here trying to find and had come to believe he might be incapable of recognizing anymore. He thought about the version of himself who had stood in that penthouse 3 months ago and decided that nobody was real, that every gesture had a calculation behind it, that the world had confirmed enough times over that genuine goodness was a story people told themselves to get through the night. He thought about the years he had spent in rooms full of people who wanted things from him, and how he had slowly moved every wall in until there was no room left for anyone to enter. He thought about loneliness and how it masquerades as self-sufficiency until you are standing in a cold bus shelter at midnight with a patchwork blanket someone borrowed from their own bed, and you have no more arguments left. He thought about the boy he had been in the 2-bedroom apartment before the world taught him to be careful. He cried alone in the yellow light. For the first time in years, he could honestly count. Not the careful, controlled kind. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and necessary and has been waiting a long time for the permission. The black car came on a Tuesday. 2 of them, actually, pulling silently to the curb on Clement Street in the early afternoon. Marcus had called his assistant that morning from the prepaid phone and said 4 words. "Asterisk, come to me. Please." Asterisk, his voice, had apparently communicated something his usual instructions did not, because they came without any of the usual preparatory questions. His driver stepped out first, then his assistant, both in the formal dark clothing that constituted, in his world, the uniform of seriousness. They stood beside the car and looked at the man sitting on the concrete ledge in a faded gray sweatshirt and torn jeans, and their professionalism held, but barely. Delia arrived at her usual time, turning the corner with her canvas bag, still fighting the same umbrella, 7 weeks after she had first stopped. She saw the cars. She saw the 2 men in suits. She slowed, confused, her eyes moving to Marcus. He stood. He reached up and pulled the knit cap from his head and ran a hand through his hair, and something in the gesture, something in the straightening of his posture, the steadiness in his eyes, made her expression shift from confusion into something quieter and more careful. He said, "My name is Marcus Hale. I've been telling you a version of the truth that wasn't the whole truth, and I'm sorry for that, and I want to explain if you'll let me." She did not run. She did not yell. She stood very still and watched him with the same clear, direct gaze she had turned on him the first time, the gaze that saw a person rather than a category. He told her everything. The penthouse, the years of calculated betrayal and careful disappointment, the decision to disappear into ordinariness and see what he found there. He told her that what he had found was weeks of confirmation of everything he had already believed. And then one afternoon on a rainy street, a woman who had stopped when she could have kept walking, who had sat on cold ground when she could have stood above him, who had loaned him a blanket from her own bed and chased him down the street to return $40 she could have rationalized keeping. He said, "You gave me something I had stopped thinking existed. You didn't do it for any reason, except that it was the right thing. And I don't know if you'll believe me, or if I've lost any right to ask anything from you at all, but I want to offer you something. Not charity, not a handout. I have a foundation that does real work in the city, and I need people who understand what struggle actually looks like from the inside. I want to offer you a role in building something that helps people. A real role. A salary that reflects the actual weight of the work. I want to offer it because your character has demonstrated, every day for 7 weeks, exactly the quality of judgment that this work requires." She was quiet for a long moment. The umbrella hung at her side, finally still. She said, "I need to ask you something first." He said, "Anything." She said, "If I take this, will I be able to speak honestly? Will my opinion count even when it disagrees with yours? Because I've worked for people before who said they wanted honesty and meant something else." He felt the question settle into him, the weight and the precision of it, the question of a person who has learned the same lessons he has, from the other direction. He said, "Yes, I need you to disagree with me. That's the entire point." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at the car, then back at him. She said, "You should know that the blanket is still mine. I'll want it back." He laughed, a real one, the kind he had forgotten he had, and said, "I was going to have it cleaned and returned." She said, "Don't have it cleaned. I like the way it is." Later, Marcus would try to explain to people what the experiment had taught him, and he would find that the important things always resisted the neat summary. He could say that he had gone looking for proof that goodness was real and had found it. He could say that he had been changed by a woman with a broken umbrella and a borrowed blanket and an absolute unwillingness to accept a reward for doing what she believed was simply right. But what he kept coming back to was simpler than any of it. What he kept returning to was this. For 43 years he had believed that his value to the world was in what he had accumulated, and for 3 weeks on a cold street he had discovered that stripped of every single thing he had accumulated, he was nothing, just a man on concrete that people stepped around, and then someone had stopped and looked at him and said, "Have you eaten?" and meant it. That was the whole lesson. That was everything. Not that money was meaningless, not that success was hollow, but that the richest thing a human being can possess is the genuine, freely given, uncalculated capacity to see another person and respond to what they find there, not with what is practical or strategic or profitable, but with what is simply and irreducibly right. He had started with every material advantage the world offered and had ended up impoverished in the ways that matter most. She had worked 2 jobs and sent money home and raised children that weren't hers and given sandwiches she couldn't spare. And she had been, every single day of those 7 weeks, one of the wealthiest people he had ever encountered. The foundation they built together over the following years was extraordinary by most measures. It reached people in the exact places that mattered, not from above, not with pity, but from beside, eye to eye, on the same ground. But Marcus knew, and he said it in the small moments rather than the large ones, that the foundation had not been built with his money or his connections or his strategy. It had been built on a rainy Tuesday on Clement Street, by a woman who stopped when she did not have to, who sat down when she could have stood above him, who ran after him with $40 that were not hers to keep, who looked at a man the world had decided was invisible and saw, without effort, without agenda, without anything except the basic practice of her own deep character, a person. That was where it started. That was where everything real always starts. Not in the penthouse, not in the accumulated wins, not in the rooms where power shakes hands with itself. It starts on the ground. It starts when someone stops.